Hello and welcome to the Hope at Work podcast. With me today is Fiona Jamison. She is the Vice President of Research and People Analytics at People Results. So Fiona, maybe let's just start right there. Who is People Results and what do you do for them?
That's a great question. So, Pupil Results, we're a workforce solutions consulting firm, which sounds very fancy, but we basically have practice areas for our clients. The largest practice area for us is labor relations. So, we help organization manage their labor relations. We also have a communications practice for all things employee communications, an organizational development and change practice for all things change management when clients are trying to institute new technologies and adopt new approaches. And then we have a digital practice that falls under our communications for all things video, employee texting, all apps, websites, that kind of thing. And then my practice area, we're a bunch of data geeks. We are the research and people analytics team. And what that really means is we're responsible for all of the employee listening projects. So anything from onboarding to exit, helping our clients do leadership assessments, risk assessments. We have a lot of focus on, what the employee experience is. And then in addition to that, we help our clients do more advanced people analytics. So really understanding the impact of HR initiatives on the rest of the business. So if you're investing in a lot of training, what does that mean? What does that do for your bottom line? If you have a lot of labor risk, what does that mean to your bottom line in terms of your turnover and predicting turnover? So in addition to do all the listening stuff, we do, how do you take that and convert it into bottom line dollars? So that's the world that I live in.
I love that world. Thank you for describing it that way. So you mentioned a couple things there I want to unpack. You talked about onboarding to exit, and you talked about the employee experience. I want to talk about one particular topic that relates to both of those, layoffs. Usually that is not a very good employee experience.
No.
So layoffs have been in the media a lot. They always are, right? It's not like it's never not a prominent topic, but it seems like lately it's been a hotter topic. We've heard, who's it been? UPS, Amazon, Intel, Nestle. They've all laid off tens of thousands of people. And what I'm gleaning from the announcements of these layoffs is it's all AI's fault, Fiona. It's not us as companies. It's AI is creating all of this opportunity and automation, and we have no choice but to lay people off. And yet, I was at the HR symposium, the Gartner HR symposium, just a few short months ago, okay? And what they said was that only 1 in 5 AI implementations has achieved any type of measurable ROI. So 20% of these organizations have had any kind of success with it, and yet the majority of them are like, well, we're laying people off because of AI. That doesn't reconcile, okay? So let's start there in terms of why do you think we're seeing some of these significant layoffs? And is AI part of the equation, or is it the scapegoat?
My gut tells me it's a little bit of both. There is some scapegoating going on for some of the larger organizations, but I also think that there has been an impact of just technology advancement in general, right? We're getting more efficient. We're spending less time on lower administrative tasks. So I think there's a certain level in the organization that's been impacted by that. Things like, customer service centers are being replaced by chatbots and, they're now dealing with higher level challenges that maybe come through from customers. We've got programmers and a lot of tech folks getting laid off. But I don't think it's to blame for all of the layoffs. There was 1.2 million layoffs in 2025, which was the highest layoffs, over 400,000 more than the prior year. So they have been steadily increasing, with last year being the highest layoffs since 2020, right? Since the pandemic. So the fact that we're getting back up to kind of pandemic levels of layoffs suggests that there is something else going on. And I don't think they're going to slow down. I think they're going to continue. response to your, only 1 in 5 AI efforts are failing or are succeeding, I think is very true. I think in fact, we just developed an AI maturity assessment that looks at both the people side of change, like how we adopt AI and are we ready for it, and the data governance side of change that looks at, is our data in the right place? Do we making sure our data security is all settled? And I think, when you look at your own organizational maturity, a lot of the early adopters didn't necessarily do all of the due diligence perhaps that they needed to. That said, I'm a proponent of fail quickly and fail fast. Better than to adopt something and then leave it running even if it's not working for you. So I think there's a combination of things going on.
I totally agree. Not to throw them completely under the bus, there is some truth to the fact that we're expecting to see some efficiencies and the ability to be more productive as a result of these new technologies. I just think it's funny that they're using that as seemingly the scapegoat. But let's talk about what happens after the fact. I know that you like to talk about the survivor experience and what happens after the layoff. So I don't know if maybe you coined the term or somebody else did, this idea of survivor syndrome. But what happens to the folks that are left in the organization after a layoff in your experience?
So it's a great question. And I've actually been studying survivors since the 90s. My doctorate was in the impact of downsizing on survivors. So the term's been around for a long time. I unfortunately didn't coin that phrase, but perhaps wish I had. But what I studied back then is still very relevant today. It's the fact that companies tend to assume that once they've done layoffs, we're now just going to move forward, right? And the reality is you have shaken the core of your employees. The baseline of any kind of level of engagement is security, right? If I feel secure in my job and then I have the things and tools that I need and the team that I have, and then I can be truly, motivated. If you don't have security, which is eliminated in many cases after layoffs, like if they lay those people off, they could lay me off, is the first question somebody says, right? If it happened to them, it can happen to me. Survivor syndrome is something that happens post-layoff, and it is a sort of a psychological term that says these people are going through some trauma, right? There's fear, there's anger, there's guilt, right? I feel bad that I have my job, but my best friends here, my coworkers that I've worked with for 20 years are now gone and unemployed. And most people know the impact of layoffs is you don't walk straight into another job necessarily, right? So they know that their peers are now struggling with unemployment, and here they are still employed. In addition to that, right, so there's that emotional response, right? There's a behavioral response post-layoff, which is very typical. So they have less trust in leadership, right? You said what you were going to do and you did it, but you didn't maybe do it the way I expected you to do it. People behave in ways that try to protect themselves. We call it protectionism, right? But they sort of say, I'm going to keep hold of what I've got. This is my value. This is what I bring to the organization. Therefore, it reduces collaboration, right? It means that I'm not necessarily sharing information with you as much because, I'm trying to protect my little world. So innovation can decrease, collaboration can decrease. You often have increased turnover, right? People who are usually your best performers think, oh, it's not secure here anymore.
Right.
I'm out, sayonara. And so if you don't handle layoffs correctly, you could end up losing more than you want to lose, and especially top performers. So the one thing I always tell companies, if you're going to lay people off, you are being judged by your employees and they are watching how you do it. So how you communicate a layoff, how you involve people. If you treat them with dignity and respect and celebrate their contribution to the company so far, your survivors are going to say, okay, if that happens, they'll treat me well too. So your employees are judging you right from the minute you make an announcement of layoffs. And that doesn't disappear overnight.
It doesn't, does it? You used one particular term that I find fascinating, and I think we've all experienced it, and that is the guilt that you feel when you're a survivor and you see people around you who are no longer here. And I've never actually put a label on it, but you just did, and that really struck a chord with me, that guilt factor is real for those folks that are left behind. You also talked about a few things diminish? You talked about trust, of course, goes down. You talked about collaboration and innovation dissipating. But I think there's also kind of a hidden productivity tax, in layoffs. So maybe talk a little bit about what you see in terms of the level of engagement and even like discretionary effort going down as a result of a layoff. Have you
Yes,
experienced that?
absolutely. So what typically happens when you lay people off is, let's say you had a department of 10 people and five are now gone. Typically the work hasn't gone away, right? So it's like now there's five people going, I got to do that too. And if leadership doesn't do a good job of role clarity post layoff, like these people now feel stressed and burdened and like, oh my God, what do I got to do this and that job? And so if you don't help people reprioritize what's important for their role, it's going to lead to burnout, right? People are going to say, I'm not going above and beyond you. I'm doing my job and part of that job that disappeared. And then in terms of discretionary effort, the best way to describe discretionary effort for me is, let's say you have a 9 to 5 business and the phone rings at 5 p.m. Are you picking up the phone? Right? If you're an engaged employee, you're like, oh, one last call, I'm going to get this and I'm going to take it. And oh, I'm going to help whoever's on the call. And even if it's to say, hey, I can get that to you first thing tomorrow morning, or, let's have a conversation tomorrow. Like that is an engaged employee, right? Discretionary effort. I'm going above and beyond. If at 5 o'clock that phone rings and you go, oh, heck no, 5 p.m., I'm out of here. That's where you see the difference. And so we absolutely see that decrease post layoff. In fact, where we've done engagement surveys before and after layoffs, we typically see about a 30 to 40% drop in engagement scores. So if your engagement score is like, let's say 70, right, which is a solid engagement score, you could be looking at a score of like 40, right, post layoff. And it's because the trust is gone, their sense of security is gone. They now probably feel overwhelmed. They're unhappy that maybe some certain people have been laid off, and they're worried about their own future. And the group that is often hurt the most in layoffs is that middle manager group. It's the managers of your employees, because they're the ones who they got the announcements, right? They were told, we're laying people off. And then they've had to communicate that to their teams. So they're creating this unrest. And then employees are coming to them all the time, right? With what's going on? Who's letting go? What's happening? What's happening to me? What does this mean for me? What does this mean for our department? What does this mean for our strategy? Right? They're kind of being bombarded. We typically don't train frontline managers on how to manage during a layoff. Right? They become that first port of call, that front line of defense. And we haven't necessarily let them know that that's happening. And by the way, you're going to have to be ready for it. And then the worst people to be affected is HR, right? HR leaders who have had to tell 10, 50, 100, 1,000 people, you no longer have a job. That is an incredibly hard conversation to have. And then in some cases, I ran a chief people officer think tank with Villanova University here in Philadelphia. And we were talking about how in many cases, the head of HR has to lay off all these people. And in some cases, they have to lay themselves off at the end.
Yeah.
Right. There were 2 people in the room and said, yep, I've done that twice, where I've laid off hundreds of people and then I've turned around and given my own papers to myself. Imagine how traumatizing that is.
No doubt. No doubt.
There's no lucky winner here.
No, there's not. And I can absolutely speak from experience here, Fiona. So, I spent a lot of time as an HR practitioner, and I recall vividly having to go through layoffs. And I personally had to lay off 10 people in one day, just go from one meeting to the next and give people this terrible news, which most of them, of course, did not see coming. And so the reactions were extreme. It's very taxing on the HR professional. But once again, you give me these new insights that I didn't think about. I didn't think about how challenging it can be for middle management. I think sometimes the executives almost get insulated from the aftermath because of where they sit. They're untouchable. They're far off. Whereas middle management, I've got access to you right now. I want to know what's going on. I want to know what happened. So let's talk about the communication side of this.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, again, I remember being in HR and laying people off, and people in the organization going, "You in HR handled that so poorly." And it's like, is there a good way to do this? Because I'd like to know what it is. So, what does good look like when it comes to communicating a layoff? Do you over index on giving tons of information? Do you keep it kind of vague? Like, how do you see that play out?
Hi, I'm Stephen Rothberg.
And I'm Jeanette Leeds.
And together, we're the co-hosts of the High Volume Hiring Podcast.
Are you involved in hiring dozens or even hundreds of employees a year? If so, you know that the typical sourcing tools, tactics, and strategies, they just don't scale.
Yeah, our bi-weekly podcast features news, tips, case studies, and interviews with the world's leading experts about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to high-volume hiring.
Make sure to subscribe today.
So it somewhat depends where you are in the world, right? How much notice you have to give people. But the general rule is be as transparent and as authentic as you can. Over communicate. You cannot over communicate in a layoff situation. People have more questions than you could possibly imagine. And they're generally listening to, what do we call it, with them? What's in it for me? Right? That's the employee's singular radio station that they're tuning into every day, is like, what's in it for me? What does this do for me? So you have to be aware of who your audience groups are and what your messaging should be. I think that communicate early, communicate often, and with clarity. And if you can, create a single source of truth, like a place on your intranet or somewhere where people can go pull information as well as that they receive it. Like, don't assume that we sent an email, everybody's read it, right? No, not true, right? We've all deleted those emails because we haven't had time, or we've gotten 10 emails afterwards that we're just like, oh wait, wasn't there something about layoffs I should read, right? So relying on email is a poor choice. People want to see you when it comes to layoffs. They want to know what's going on and why, and they want to understand what is the goal here, what is the strategy. So the more you can have those communications point to future state and have people focus on that as soon as you can, that's a good strategy. Letting them know, here's the reason we're doing this, here's where we're headed, here's why we've made this decision. And if you have questions about that, you can go to this source and read more about it. And create spaces for senior leaders to have airtime.
Yeah.
Now, they've got to probably be prepared and trained for those open listening spaces, right? If you're going to put a CEO in the front of a town hall, make sure they're prepared to have the answers to the questions that are most likely to be answered, right?
Yeah.
It's not good to wing it in these scenarios because you can create more damage. So structured, regular updates, various channels, emails not enough is the best way to go.
Yeah.
And I'll give you one example. Back in the 90s when I was studying this, there was an organization who remain unnamed who did it really, really well. And one of the things they did was they actually threw kind of like a farewell party for all of the employees that were getting laid off. And they basically said, this is a group, and they brought them all in. They celebrated them. They provided food and drink. Everybody in the organization got to say thank you, well done, farewell, And what was fascinating about that to me was it acknowledged the value that these people had contributed to the business. It allowed people to say goodbye. It reduced survivor guilt, right? But also made those that were left behind feel like, wow, okay, I know this was a tough decision for the company, but they really valued and recognized those people, right? They'd been here for 20, 30 years. Imagine just giving them a cardboard box and saying, leave right now. That doesn't feel respectful. That doesn't feel like the employees have value. This company said they did it all on the Thursday, and the Friday they said, we're going to have a farewell reception. We want you all to come. It was kind of closed door. They spent an hour or two, and then they left. And it was very well done. It's an unusual example, but I think it speaks to how you give a future focus and how you celebrate the employees that you've had. So
I have literally never heard of that kind of approach. and I love it. Now, having said that, I'm sure that that's threading the needle of doing it well, right? Where you do that too big and people are like, what is this, a big celebration and party? Like, this isn't a celebratory mood that I'm feeling in. And you're spending all this money on food and drink that you could have maybe kept me. So again, I'm sure there's just like this delicate balancing act of doing what you just described in a way that actually comes across as, once again, you use a great term, authentic. I love that. And that's, I think, what bothers me so much about the headlines of, well, it's AI. That just seems inauthentic to me.
Yeah, yeah, it absolutely is. And it doesn't recognize what got you here, right? And we all know that what got us to where we are today is probably not going to get us to that next milestone. We know that change is constant and that we constantly have to adapting and evolving and innovating. That's why the biggest companies of the world survive, because they never stop innovating. They never stop moving forward.
Yeah.
But how do you celebrate the moments along the way? And we always talk about, from an employee listening standpoint, what are the moments that matter, right? It's your first day on the job. Was the computer ready for you? Did they have a ID card ready for you? When did you first meet your supervisor? It was day one, or did you have to wait a week, right? It's all of those moments that matter that make the difference to the employee experience, and how you exit an organization, whether it's a layoff, a retirement, or just a departure. What is that experience like? It will speak volumes about the culture of the business.
No doubt. So you mentioned something there that I think is really critical. I think all organizations today have to be incredibly adaptable. They have to change tack frequently, dramatically. So we can't expect them to, completely avoid these things. But how can we maybe mitigate the impact? How can we potentially look at alternatives to layoffs? I guess what I'm getting at is it'd be great if we just didn't have to do these things. And so why does it feel like, Fiona, that so many organizations are reactive versus anticipating the needs of the organization and the number of people that they're going to need? Why aren't they doing more strategic workforce planning, which of course I have a vested interest in the organization that I work for now? But because, we all hear about layoffs, and then 2 years later, what happens? That same company hires back half of those people.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't they more proactive in planning for the future?
I think it's a great question, and I see the same things that you're seeing. There's a couple of things that I think are missing in some organizations. Like, most companies, a good company should have a 1, a 3, a 5, and maybe a 10-year plan of where we're going, right? They should be reading the markets. They should be understanding their customers. They should be expanding who they're working with or diversifying. They should have a plan of where I want to be 10 years from now. However, many organizations are lucky if they have a 1-year plan. Right. And, as sad as that is, right, that's the reality. I've met with many teams. I'm like, where do you want to be 5 years from now? And they're like, not sure. The good companies are the ones that are saying, all right, let's take a look at our people data. Let's do people analytics, workforce analytics. Who are we going to need 5 years from now? Are they scenario planning? Are they saying, if we're going to move into these 4 markets, and we know that the market is about the same as this market over here, and we have 500 people over here, we're probably going to need 500 over here.
Right.
What does that 500 look like? What is the economy in that area? What is the available labor force? Who are our competitors? Who can we recruit from? Organizations that are like planning around consumer behavior. A lot of people moving to Texas. Like, what does that mean for our workforce? There's people wanting to leave the United States. What does that do? Right? We got so these are big questions that are staffing questions that if you have good people data, right? Who's on board right now, who you've had in the past, and the size of your labor market, right? I did some work earlier last year, which was looking at a company that was struggling with really, really high turnover. They couldn't keep employees beyond 90 days. They were literally going to run out of the available workforce in 6 months if they didn't stop the churn. And so we did some market research for them, understanding what were the demographics of the local workforce. Did they need to pull from a bigger commuter area? What was the cost of living there? Is this even the right place to have this plant? Or should we move it to where labor is abundant, right? And what are the cost implications of that? Good companies are looking 5 or 10 years down the road. And they're running scenarios about, let's assume that 5 years from now, the average graduate student is going to have $150,000 of student debt. What is that going to mean in terms of what their salary expectations are going to be? Right? So there's these kind of more global labor market questions that a good company should be thinking about. And even if they're thinking of shrinking their workforce because they're going to adopt robots or AI or, automating some of the processes, chances are you're going to need higher levels of staff, like engineers or programmers or developers. Where are they? Can they be remote? Are they in your market? If not, where are you going to get them from? If you're not asking those questions, you're always going to be reactive, and you're going to overstaff when you don't need to, and you're going to be running too lean when you need to grow.
Again, it's such a delicate balancing act, and you bring up a great point. It's supply and demand, right? It's not just one of those, and so I think I see a lot of organizations fail to look outside of their organization to realize, whoa, we're going to need a lot of this kind of role. Data scientist, for example. There aren't very many. And the ones that are out there are very expensive. Have you thought about that and how that works into your large-term planning and budgeting and all of that? So really good point. So, okay, there's opportunities maybe for us to avoid some of this to some degree with good scenario and modeling and planning. There's also an opportunity to redistribute talent before we pull the trigger. Let's reskill people. Let's redeploy people. What does good look like there in terms of organizations that are thinking through how do we retain the staff and just maybe move them around in the organization and think about internal mobility? What have you seen that's worked well?
Yeah. So I will first of all say that many organizations don't know what they have. Right? What they hired, like they had people submit a resume 10 years ago, right? To responded to a job description. That today, the job they have is probably very different to what they hired for, and their resume is out of date. Right? And so most organizations don't have a really good skills inventory of who they have on staff. And so it's actually something we're doing within People Results right now is, doing a complete skills inventory of our entire staff to see who do we have, what's their experience, what are their top talents, what are their opportunities for growth. So we can look at our workforce and say, okay, we've got a lot of people really good at this, but not many people good at that. How can we cross-train upgrade and upskill people? So I think starting again with the data, right? Know who you have today and then map out what you're going to need tomorrow. And chances are you probably have within your organization, I always say there's people that fall into like 3 camps. The first camp is, I love what I do. I don't ever want to do anything different and I'm passionate about it and please don't make me move, right? There's those people. There's the people that are kind of open to moving, right? Maybe they are underutilized in their current role and they want to train. And then you've often got a group of high flyers. Give me a challenge, I'll do it. Right?
Yes.
And so do you know who your people are and who's willing to move and who isn't? And then wrap that into at least once a year, you should be listening to your employees. And one of the questions you should probably ask at some point during the year is, where do you think we can become more efficient and save money? I'll tell you, your employees know. They'll say, that thing that you do, we could do that much quicker and much faster or more cost efficient. And companies tend to forget that their best resource for ideas and innovation is their own teams. So if I ever had to reduce my team, I would first say to them, hey, I need to save money. I don't want to do layoffs. What can we change? I guarantee you they would come up with 50 ideas of how to streamline, save money, save costs that probably wouldn't cost the company anything, right? And then we could not change staff. You'd be surprised of employees who have said, well, we use plastic bags for that. We should use paper bags. They'll last longer and whatever, right? Probably saves the company money. Think of 1,000, let's say you've got 10,000 employees. Think of 10,000 ideas that are cost saving. chances are that could save a bunch of layoffs.
No doubt.
So, start there. Start with your employees. Listen to them.
Yeah.
Hear what they have to say.
It comes back to what you said earlier about being transparent up front about, hey, we need to save money somewhere. We're struggling to figure out where that might be. You're on the front line. What ideas do you have?
Exactly.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay. So wrapping things up, for those organizations that it's too late, they've already experienced a layoff. Now what? This is the Hope at Work podcast, Fiona. We haven't been very hopeful today. How do we restore hope after a layoff? What can we do to address it after the fact?
Yeah, I think the first thing that leaders need to do is make sure you've really clearly communicated what the future looks like. You need a clean, clear, new Northern Star, right, to focus in on. And I think that's incredibly important because what we haven't talked about is how layoffs can affect your employer brand, right? If UPS has just laid off 40,000 people, do you think that's the first company I'm going to apply to as a new talent? Probably not, right? I'm going to go somewhere else where I might feel more secure. So you have to think about how your brand is showing up externally. But for your employees, give them a really clear North Star, right? And tell them that, these layoffs were unfortunate. And if there's going to be more, tell them. Be real clear about it. But we'd like to avoid it. And how can we get there, right? So refocus people on the future. I think leaders have to be more visible than they expect, and be willing to be open and be authentic and be empathetic with employees. And then I would also say, take that clarity of where you're headed and bring that down several layers to the frontline employee and make sure they have role clarity so that now they're not expected to do the job of 3 people, that they're still just responsible for their job and maybe have different priorities now as a function of them being less. So that clarity of direction at the strategic level needs to come all the way down to the front line where there's now clarity for that frontline employee. If you used to have 3 cashiers and now you only have 1, how do they manage their time? Given that they're going to be overwhelmed, right? So it has to come from the top, but all has to be communicated all the way down to the bottom.
Yeah. And it feels like we're going to experience more and more of that uncertainty, more and more of those changes that result in us figuring out, okay, now maybe we do have too many people in this particular role or in this particular region. How do we adapt quickly in a way that we can retain that institutional knowledge and that intellectual capital as long as humanly possible? Anything that you haven't touched on that you want to make sure the audience hears from you on this topic of layoffs?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think that one is companies who lay a lot of people off should be aware that this also puts them at risk of third-party organizing, right? Unions typically are there. They want to instill security and try to protect people's jobs. So if you're union free and you've done a mass layoffs, don't be surprised if the union comes a knocking, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is more of an immediacy effect, which is after layoffs happen, people are in shock, right? They often say that the survivor syndrome follows the same as the grieving process.
Yeah.
Shock, anger, frustration, sadness. You need to give your employees an outlet. So I always say post layoff, give it a few days or a week, and then have some listening sessions with your employees. Hear them out. They are like pressure cookers at that point, right? There's a lot of emotion, anger, feelings, stuff going on. You need to release the pressure valve. So having listening sessions, hearing your employees out, hearing what their concerns are, answering their questions early is really critical. You don't want people to fester. You don't want people to feel scared or worried because that just reduces their productivity. Like have some listening sessions, give them that opportunity to vent, and similarly give your frontline managers that same safe space, right? They're going to need to decompress as well after this, which is essentially a traumatic event. So in terms of well-being and care, making sure you're having listening sessions close to the post-layoff action as possible will help people it's always like you feel better after you've vented, right? Sometimes it's just the venting. You don't need a solution. You just want to say, wow, that sucked. That was horrible. Like, I hope we never have to do that again. You feel better. It's cathartic. And so creating the space for that to happen, I think can do wonders for those left behind.
Yeah, I love that. I'm embarrassed to admit I have never made that connection between layoffs and the grieving process. And that's something that hits close to home for me. I'm actually a facilitator for Grief Share, which is an organization that helps kind of take people through the grieving process, which, by the way, I think we all recognize, but I'll say it out loud. It's not sequential. We all experience it differently. And so giving that space, as you just described, Fiona, for different people to respond differently to the same experience is really important. So that is wonderful advice. You have been a fantastic guest. You are unquestionably getting an invite back, because my guess is there are no shortage of topics for us to discuss.
We could talk for days, I think, Marcus.
I think we could. Well, thank you so much for joining the Hope at Work podcast, Fiona. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you. See you soon.